and the Constitution. And this is an issue that no one thought about barely 4 months ago, right? Who thought about the coronavirus like in January? I was like, whatever. I was on planes, I was flying around, staying at hotels in January, whatever. And it seems in the span of like 2 weeks, we were suddenly confronted with some very significant legal questions that no one considered before. Governors began to erect checkpoints at their borders, stopping cars from New York. Did anyone ever think of such a thing? We had cities and counties mandate that people wear face masks. Do we ever think of such a thing? We had elections where courts were deciding whether to require people to submit ballots late. We had states like Texas where PPE, that is, protective equipment, was in short supply. And as a result, elective surgeries, including forms of abortion, were prohibited. We had states that banned the sale of guns, arguing that people don't need guns during an emergency, and it's too dangerous to have people meeting in person. And perhaps most prominently, we had houses of worship that were immediately told that they had to change the way they pray, almost overnight. And in this short span, the courts have been, shall we say, mostly deferential to the state. But then we have changes in the last 3 weeks. As protests swept the nation, people began assembling in large numbers. And some of them were wearing masks and practicing distancing, and others were not. And governors and mayors said that those forms of assembly were justified, that the fight against injustice warrants the risk to public health. But other forms of assembly, such as for prayer, just weren't that important. What I think the coronavirus has taught us is that the state has certain types of police powers and certain types of authorities. And during times of emergency, the government wields those authorities. But I think they wield those powers in a way that's inconsistent and based on what every government thinks is important. Some red states think that guns are important and prayer are important, and blue states think that protests and abortions are important. And throughout all of this, we saw an unwillingness of the judiciary to intervene. And perhaps that's the right approach, except when you have a conflict. What happens when the same jurisdiction simultaneously restricts prayer but allows protest? How can it be that one form of assembly is more important than another? And that's where we get to the nub of these issues. When we talk about the police power, we talk about the general welfare and who gets to decide and who gets to define it. Some states define the welfare in one way, and other states define the welfare in another way. So does the Constitution put limits on how that welfare is defined? So I'd like to spend most of my time talking about the free exercise of religion, which I think has been the most significant area of litigation. Okay? So let's start with a basic premise. Religion's old. It's been around for a very long time. Some religions older, some religions newer. But the idea of praying, among others, is old as time itself. It's been around for a very long time. Some faiths have been practicing uninterrupted for millennia, thousands of years. Plague didn't stop it. World War didn't stop it. Holocaust didn't stop it. People still found a way to assemble. Until we get to 2020. And almost overnight, houses of worship were instructed that they could not assemble. Even in small numbers of 10 or 11 people was prohibited. And the justification was we had to flatten the curve. We had to reduce the incidence of people spreading COVID. We saw instances where public funerals in the streets were broken up by police cars. Religious schools were barged into by the police who told people they had to leave. And these sorts of changes happened almost overnight. And for the most part, I think people accepted them. But then we started learning more about the virus and people started to accommodate. And one of the first forms of the accommodation was what you might call a drive-through service, which is exactly what it sounds like. On Easter Sunday, churches want to have drive-through service. People bring their cars to the parking lot of a church so that they can listen, right? So that they can talk and hear, even if they can't sit next to each other in person. And some jurisdictions said it was too risky to let people pray in their cars. Why? Well, maybe they'll get out of their cars and have to go to the bathroom and spread the disease. Some judges held, correctly in my mind, that you can't have a drive-through Wendy's, but prohibit a drive-through prayer service, right? Why one, not the other? Well, of course, there are probably more risks with religion, but I think it's based on a determination that Wendy's and Burger King and Chick-fil-A, well, maybe not Chick-fil-A, but at least Wendy's and Burger King is simply more important. People need fast food to nourish their stomachs, but you don't really need prayer to nourish your soul. You can do prayer on Zoom, right? You can watch online, right? And you could download a podcast, right? To feed your spiritual needs. The next round of litigation concerned in-person worship, right? Governments impose caps on the number of people who can be in a prayer service. But other comparable facilities had no caps. So, for example, if I want to get on an airplane, there's no limit on how many people can get into an airplane. There's no limit. You can be sitting 3 inches apart with 300 people in a plane. Okay? I could be in a warehouse, an Amazon warehouse, where people are moving back and forth, coming and going all day long. And there are no limits on how many people can be in a warehouse. We can have a nursing home where old people who are very vulnerable are sitting next to each other, inches away, with no real way of protecting the spread of this disease. But we have nursing homes. Why? Well, the government says we need Amazon Prime. We have to have a warehouse, right? And we need airplanes because people have to get around. And we need nursing homes. Where are the old people going to go? We don't need churches, right? They're just not that important. We can put houses of worship subject to more stringent standards than comparable facilities. And I think the most clear explanation of this sort of dichotomy comes from Judge Easterbrook, who people say is conservative. I'm not sure where you get this from nowadays, but they say he's conservative. He's a judge in the Seventh Circuit in Chicago. And I want to read you a quote. He said, "Feeding the body requires teams of people to work together in physical spaces. But churches can feed the spirit in other ways." Churches can feed the spirit in other ways. That's a remarkable statement. That's stunning. Basically saying you can go and pray on Zoom, but you need, Wendy's to get food, which isn't even true. It doesn't even make sense. But this is how people think. And when you start from this presumption that prayer is not important, of course these cases are easy, right? I think that the Free Exercise Clause prohibits this, that merely saying we're going to treat religion one way and non-religion another is itself a judgment about religion that runs afoul of the Free Exercise Clause. Now, who agrees with me? Not John Roberts, the man of the week, right? He gave us Blue Monday, as I call it. Monday was pretty bad. He gives Blue Thursday. Thursday was pretty bad. I call this Blue Week, and my friends, we're heading to a Blue June. Yes, a Blue June. But that's what Justice Roberts said. He argued that so long as the government treats similar facilities alike, treat a movie theater like a church, or treat like a theater like a church. That's the same thing, right? Putting out production of Pippin's no different than taking communion. These are very similar acts to the chief. The vote in that case was 5-4. The chief agreed with the court's 4 liberals to uphold restrictions in California on worship. Other courts have come out differently, right? Some courts have held that you need prayer, right? Judge Sutton, for example, in the Sixth Circuit said you have these life-sustaining businesses for law firms and laundromats and liquor stores and gun shops, right? They can open. But soul-sustaining groups cannot. I think that's an important dichotomy, that people simply treat religious as less important. Okay, now I've only mentioned religion so far, but what complicates this question even further is speech, right? We were told in no uncertain terms that people could not assemble in public, that it was against public health, we had to flatten the curve, it was the worst thing in the world. And then it seems overnight, whatever. So we'll just forget about that, right? Protests spread across the nation, around the world. In my hometown of Houston, tens of thousands of people assembled near City Hall, standing shoulder to shoulder for hours. There was a church service held in the city of Houston for Mr. Floyd. Thousands of people moved in and out of the church waiting on line. There was not distancing. The police did not break it up. Everyone was just staying there. Some were wearing masks, some were not wearing masks. I don't know what happened, the consequences of that, but public health officials said this is worthwhile. Governors agreed. Governors and mayors said that these types of events were so significant, were so important, that they warranted this sort of special treatment. But houses of worship were treated differently. For houses of worship, they're still under these strict requirements, right? They're still under these strict requirements. And nothing's going to change that. I think at some point the courts will have to intervene, and they'll have to address how can it be that one type of events are treated so differently than another. And I don't know that the governments will have a good answer. I think they're going to have to admit, whether they want to or not, that these political protests are simply more important, and they justify relaxing social distancing rules than other events. Okay? Let's talk for a minute about the Second Amendment. This is one that didn't come up very much recently, but was pretty important early on. A number of states said we need to ban all non-essential businesses. And one of the non-essential businesses, of course, were gun stores, right? Gun stores, of course. But the only way to buy a gun in these states was through a gun store. So banning gun stores was a full and permanent prohibition on the right to bear arms. You could not acquire a weapon. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court actually sharply divided this and held that, you can shut down gun stores. But on appeal, right, maybe they would lose at the Supreme Court. So Pennsylvania, instead of losing at the Supreme Court, simply withdrew the policy. Said, you know what, we'll let gun stores open. They did not want to lose at the Supreme Court. They would have won. John Roberts would have ruled for them anyway, but they decided to not risk it. Other states have managed to play keep away. Okay, so there haven't been any more Second Amendment cases. There were abortion cases. A number of states prohibited elective surgery, which is everything from a colonoscopy to a root canal. Everything was prohibited. People had surgery delayed, which had significant health problems. In Texas, one of the procedures deemed elective was abortion. And the argument was we need to preserve our protective equipment, right? We need to preserve masks and gowns and gloves. We can't have people wasting these equipments on these sorts of procedures. Okay. It was challenged. The trial court declared it unconstitutional. It bounced up and down to and from the Supreme Court. But the bottom line, the end result was that the Supreme Court's, the Fifth Circuit, it didn't go to the Supreme Court, went to the Fifth Circuit up and down. And ultimately, the Fifth Circuit held that the state has authority in times of epidemics to perhaps burden rights. They can't violate the rights outright. That is, there has to be some opportunity to have an abortion. But if an abortion can be delayed a few weeks, you might have to wait. In other words, you do not have the right to an abortion at the moment you want it, which might seem an obvious statement, but was actually a holding of the court which had not been reached before. So at least in the Fifth Circuit, we now have a holding that the state can effectively delay abortions, but they can't push you past the point at which they're impermissible. So that was actually a fairly significant ruling, which I think people forgot about, but will come up soon enough. The next issue I want to talk about is voting rights. Voting rights. People have, generally speaking, a right to vote, but there's no right to vote absentee. Some states have very strict absentee ballot rules, and some states have basically automatic absentee balloting. Everyone votes absentee. There's no polling places. We saw an election in Wisconsin where people had to wait on long lines to vote. And a case actually went to the Supreme Court about whether ballot deadlines can be extended for COVID, and people couldn't get their ballots in time. The court held 5-4 that you cannot force the state to extend the ballot extensions. Turned out it wasn't that big of a deal. People got their ballots in on time for the most part, but this was a huge issue for about a couple of days till the results came in. Texas, where I live, had a different case, right? Does Texas law automatically give an absentee ballot to anyone who is subject to COVID? All of us, right? We're all possible to get COVID. Can you have in that case an automatic right to an absentee ballot? The Texas Supreme Court says no, you cannot. Why? Everyone would get it, and the legislature did not have that intent. Is that right or wrong? I don't know. It's a Texas state law decision, but I'm sure we'll have a federal litigation as well. The last thing I'll talk about before I move to Q&A is federalism. All too often people look to the federal government for solutions to all their problems. That gets it backwards. The states have primary responsibility over the health, safety, welfare, and morals of the people. That is the police power. So throughout this entire process, people saying Trump should do this, he should do that. I don't have a very high opinion of him in general, but it wasn't his job. It was a job of the states to take care of these matters primarily. And I think that was largely lost because they looked to the president as a savior, and that's not what the president does. Governors and mayors have far more power here than should the president. So I think here, actually, federalism, as usual with Trump, kind of fell into place, but perhaps not deliberately. All right, that's all I want to say for my remarks. I'd be happy to take some questions from you and maybe go a little bit later. So thank you all so much. What questions we have? And you could, if you want, you can raise your blue hands or just speak out. I don't really care. There are only 7 of us here. Yeah, Jen, go ahead.
I have a question.
Oh, Sarah, go ahead. Yep.
So I know that the courts are looking at doing virtual Zoom jury trials. How do you think that will affect the right to a jury trial, speedy trial, those type of things with virtual juries?
Yeah, thank you so much. So let's separate criminal and civil, right? With a criminal trial, I think there are serious problems with a virtual jury because if a juror is not paying attention, if the internet stream breaks, right, there are all these issues about due process. So I think there are really huge problems for criminal. For civil, I think it's not as big of a deal. If the parties consent to a Zoom trial, I think it could work. The parties can consent to a bench trial as well, which could also work. Speedy trial is an issue that came up but didn't really linger. We've had delays for hurricanes and natural disasters, but we've never had a delay of quite this length. So I think a lot of people had to simply suck it up and realize they couldn't do it. Courts gave litigants the opportunity to have remote hearings. In Texas, they're actually having bench trials now by Zoom. If the parties want, I think that's okay. I'm happy with it. I mean, a related issue is also cameras in the court. We saw the Supreme Court actually live stream their arguments. I never thought I'd see the day. Never, never, never. This was a stunning change. And as a result, the court was pretty normal. I thought the arguments were lousy because of the format they chose, but there were no problems with the streaming. So I'm actually quite happy about this new development. Thanks, Sarah. I think Jen has her hand up in our virtual queue.
Yeah. Hi. I was wondering, this is a bit more of a general question, but with the stay-at-home orders and with the checkpoints, I was wondering if you had thoughts about any potential dormant commerce clause issues that may arise, with restricting, arguably commerce between states, or does the state's police power just override those concerns? I wouldn't think so.
Look, Sarah, Jen. I think the last time we had blockades between states was during the Civil War. I'm only being slightly facetious. We don't have interstate barriers. That's not something we have in this country. The Dormant Commerce Clause would, I think, apply if a state was discriminating against out-of-state businesses. There's also the Privileges and Immunities Clause of Article 4, which we all studied, which has a so-called right of travel, which means you can freely go from state to state. Those were banned. I don't know that the state's police power stretches that broad, but it will not be litigated. The issues are now moot. These are policies that were in effect for a short period and are likely to reoccur. It was the initial, here's how I describe it with Corona. Measures that made sense in March and April don't make as much sense in May and June, and definitely don't make sense in July and August. Right? As we learn more about this disease and how to contain it, how to deal with it, these sort of draconian fascist measures are harder to swallow, the harder to justify. So the deference initially, I think, is not as much warranted. We just don't know as much. So we know now much more than we knew in March. In March, like, oh my God, we're all going to die. It's like, okay, never mind, we have to stay at home. Except protesting, right? But we know more. So I think there are dormant commerce clause issues, privileges, and immunities, but they're not going to be litigated. But thanks, Jen. All right. Andrea, you have a question as well?
Yeah, I have two questions. The first question for you is particularly on religious liberty. So particularly in New York, we saw Mayor de Blasio particularly pick on the Orthodox Jewish community, stop the funerals, and now I guess they're padlocking the playground so that the kids can't play in, and then I guess the community's got really upset. They're cutting the locks. They're defying stuff, and I guess for me, I'm really shocked that no one is expressing that this is really ridiculous. You're letting people just run throughout your city without observing your curfews, without observing the lockdown orders, but then you're picking on one of your very distinct religious communities. I didn't know if you knew if there was any litigation down
there. Is, yeah.
Line. Okay. So, that makes me happy. I hope they get a win on that because it's really ridiculous. The second one is that we're starting to hear a lot about mandatory vaccine issues potentially coming up if coronavirus, if they end up getting a vaccine in states or workplaces or whatever, mandating it. And of course, there's then the question of who would get an exception and if how they'd be able to get that. Do you have any thoughts on any of the mandatory vaccine questions?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Thank you so much, Andrea. The issue in New York is stunning. I mean, Mayor de Blasio says what other people think, right? They're not supposed to say out loud, but he says out loud. He basically said that the racial justice marches are simply more important than people praying. He said what Justice Eastbrook said. They're of the same page. Mass religious funerals were outside, were broken up by police cars, and these people were not broken up. Their protests. There's definitely a double standard. I think most people would agree on that. There's litigation now in New York against both Governor Cuomo and the mayor of the city, de Blasio. One of the other issues is also summer camps. All these Jewish summer camps have been shut down, and other comparable gatherings are allowed to assemble. They're seeking a TRO in federal court today, or I think tomorrow. It's coming really soon. I'm not optimistic. I think the courts are just going to say we don't know enough. We'll defer to the government. And Chief Justice Roberts has already shown his colors on this one, so I think it's going to be an unfortunate loss. I don't think they're going to win. But anyone who can look at the situation objectively realizes that they're not treating like as like. They're treating different situations differently. I'm sorry, they're treating same situations differently. Your second question concerned vaccines. There's an old case from 1905, give or take, called Jacobson v. Massachusetts, an old case, which involved a mandatory smallpox vaccination. That is, can the government force you to have a smallpox vaccination? And the court said yes. The court even held years later that a woman could be forcibly sterilized. That's Buck v. Bell. It's a good law. It's a good law right now. So the short answer is I think the state can have wide requirements for vaccinations. What about the religious objections? I think under the free exercise clause, those are not going to work. It's a law of general applicability. And that's a case called Employment Division versus Smith. It's a law of general applicability. They're not targeting one faith or the other. I don't see how a vaccine mandate's unconstitutional. Now, states have RFRAs, Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And perhaps under RFRA, you may have a more narrowly tailored approach where certain exemptions are required. There are some faiths that oppose vaccines. The challenge, of course, is obtaining what's called herd immunity. You know that phrase? In order for a vaccine to really be effective, a certain percentage of society needs to be vaccinated. I don't know what that number is, 60, 70%. There's a number. But whatever that number is, we don't even know what that number is. It's not even clear because the vaccine doesn't exist. And perhaps the state can say if we create too many exemptions, we won't be able to have herd immunity, and that undermines the entire purpose of this policy. I'm not looking forward to the vaccine litigation. I'll say it. The anti-vaxxers are not the most sympathetic crowd. They're not. They're kind of obnoxious. They're always out and about protesting with their kids, and I don't know what to say. The Jenny McCarthy's of the world. They're not religiously motivated, but they sort of pull together. There are some people who have sincere religious beliefs against vaccinations. Maybe they're the ones. But I think people merely have an ideological opposition. They think they're unsafe. But look, I'll make this point bluntly. We don't know the efficacy, the safety of these drugs. I mean, I'm speaking completely out of turn here, but these are things that will go through accelerated reviews. And, people may not want to be first line to get this injected. So those challenges will lose also in court. And I think what will happen is people who don't get the vaccine will be fined. I don't think the state will manually jab a needle in your arm. In fact, in Jacobson, the case was if you don't get vaccinated, you pay a $5 fine. Will people just pay the fine and move on with their lives? Probably. They're not going to, in other words, we're not going to have someone from the state strap you down on a table and jam a needle in your arm. I think it's very unlikely. So people just have to pay fines, and they'll challenge those fines in courts, and they'll probably lose. What else? Other questions? Heather, Mike, Nick? None? Nothing? Going once?
I'll give a question.
All right, go for it.
So my question goes back to the first question that was asked. When a vaccine comes around, do you believe courtrooms will return to how they used to be, or do you think juries will continue to be virtual for the foreseeable future? Do you feel like it's more efficient that way? I know a lot of my friends that are attorneys have said they prefer Zoom trials, and they prefer
Really?
Zoom bench trials.
Why?
As they've been going on
Why?
in New York.
Why do they prefer them?
Well, my former boss said that he didn't need to put on a suit and go to the courthouse, but that's just one lawyer.
Okay.
But a lot of the other ones preferred it because they could have their notes right in front of them at home. They, didn't need to. A whole host of.
They didn't need to memorize their arguments like you would in court?
Exactly.
Oh, man, that's lazy.
That's
I mean,
really
look.
what I was trying to get to without saying.
Yeah, no, I hear you. Your friends are lazy.
Yes, a few. I've heard that from a few people. I vehemently disagree and think that courts are better in person. But do you think they'll return to how they used to?
I mean, look, let me make the point two ways. First, even if there's a vaccine, we may be stuck with Corona for a couple years. Like, I don't want to make light. I mean, we need to vaccinate 6 billion people, right? So, I mean, this is not going to disappear. And it's possible the vaccines may not be effective for very long. We have to get booster shots. There are a million reasons why we don't know. So I don't know that we're going back to normal in the foreseeable future. Now, if you're asking me the efficacy of online arguments, some things are better than others. I think appellate arguments can be done online. Truly, I think appellate arguments with Zoom are just fine because you don't have to introduce evidence. There's no witness. There's no jury box. They're just talking to a judge. And so long as there's a video so you can see the judge's feedback, it works. As it stands now, judges are allowed to do their arguments, appellate arguments online. The Ninth Circuit will often have a judge in different locations, so you don't even see the judge live. So this is old. I think appellate arguments. Trial court, different deal. You have a jury, you have jury selection, you have evidences, you have a witness box, right? You have a lot of things going on that I think are harder to replicate. Especially if there's technical difficulties with all those parties. Someone's Zoom cuts out, you have to pause the trial for an hour until their internet resumes, right? There are just so many issues. Let's talk about something closer to home, law school, right? You guys are what, 1L, 2Ls, 3Ls? I don't know if law school will be normal before you graduate. I mean that sincerely. This may be with us for a couple of years, right? Where there's simply not enough space to fit everyone in the building, and you have to separate them with 6 feet apart. So half of you are online. You're not going to have a law school career, a law school experience. You're not going to have socials. There's no barrister ball, right? There's not going to be, social hours. There's not going to be happy hours. You're not going to have a Chick-fil-A buffet at FetSoc events. No more picking up food. Can you imagine? Can you imagine today everyone just grabbing their muddy hands into a thing of Chick-fil-A and just can you just fathom that? Like, I did events 3 months ago where everyone's just shoving, grabbing sandwiches, whatever, pot bellies, whatever, one after the other. No one cares. Could you let anyone know? So things that we took for granted, like, for example, I always bring students cookies. The first day of class, I bring these trays of Costco cookies. I can't do that anymore, ever. I just pass around, like, oh, you take a cookie. I can't do that anymore. So things that were normal are now not allowed. And I think a lot of our expectations of what is permissible will have to be modified. Eventually, I think we'll have to have Zoom trials. We'll have to do it. Maybe the answer is you put the jury in an overflow room where they're all seated 6 feet apart, so they're not all together. And you have the trial in one room, the jury in another, and sort of you space everyone out. Maybe you don't put the jury in the box. Maybe you put the jury in the the spectator area, so you space the jury out, and you're not allowed to have anyone from the public. There are a lot of ways to handle this. Yeah, we're not going back. Yeah, Nick.
Think I thought about it, and I think I had a question.
Yeah, go for it.
The first thing I thought of, whoa, big screen. First thing I thought of when I saw all the stay-at-home orders, it brought me back to property class, and I thought, is there any potential with all these stay-at-home orders for any claims for regulatory taking? Because you're shutting down all these businesses, they can't gain any profit. Is that a possibility?
Yeah, there have been several lawsuits filed nationwide arguing that the shutdown orders were takings of private property. Look, I teach property also. Those cases are going to have a really tough hill to climb because the courts have generally held that when the state's acting within its police power, they're not affecting a taking, right? That if something is within the police power, it's permissible. And put that point more bluntly, people don't have an interest in keeping their business open during the pandemic, right? The states can just shut down businesses altogether. So I think those cases are not going to be successful, unfortunately. I'm sympathetic to them, but the courts aren't going to start awarding just compensation to every building that was shut down. It's simply not feasible. Andrew, I think you're the last one. Anything on your mind? I'm sorry, Andrew. I'm sorry. It was Heather.
No, I have a couple curiosities about
Sure.
the Defense Production Act, but
About what?
constitutional.
You have curiosities about what? I didn't hear you. I'm sorry.
The Defense Production Act.
Oh, we haven't talked about that recently. Yeah, the DPA.
Yeah, I don't want to derail the constitutional discussion.
Whatever, you got me. Go for it.
I guess I'm just curious. I know a lot of contractors and not even businesses that are familiar with or who deal mostly in government contracts, but they're having difficulty meeting, or they were having difficulty meeting some of the demands that these contracts were demanding. And so I know in the initial point, with any DPA contract, I think you can deny that contract in the beginning, but as soon as you accept it, the penalties are, I think, rather harsh, and all the individual contracting officers had different standards by which to amend those contracts, and so that seemed like a very big free-for-all that was happening for like a month and a half, and so I don't really know if there was resolution there or how that's going to proceed now that or as we leave that and as these firms are trying to get recourse for all of that.
I wish I had an answer. I have no idea. I have no idea. The DPA kind of popped up out of nowhere and then disappeared very quickly. It's like, why did he do it? Oh, he did it. Now we don't care, right? It was this issue that really mattered for a week and no one cares about it anymore. I'm generally skeptical when the government tells you to make things because you're not going to make it well and on time because you're not moving at profit. So, and it turns out we need ventilators. They're not that important, right? The ventilators can actually be harmful in some cases. So, look, my point is, government. Oh, I don't need to tell you. But government doesn't know what they're doing most times in general, especially during an emergency. And we shouldn't pretend for a second that these are well thought out plans. Republican, Democrat, doesn't matter. They're making up as they go along. These quarantines, these stay-at-home orders, they've never been done before. These are like public health officials, like wildest dreams to have this power. And I think deferring to the experts lasts long enough. But even in places like New York, it's like, all right, let's move on with our lives, right? Let's learn to live with this, rather than being locked up for forever. All right, that answer your question a little bit. All right, thank you. And one trick, if you press the space bar, you can unmute yourself just for a second. Hold down the space bar. Ooh, yeah. Oh. So if you're ever in class and you need to put in a quick comment, just hold down the space bar. It takes you off mute. You're welcome. See, that was worth the price of admission.
Question.
Yeah.
So I saw a lot of people on social media, and they were saying if they were kind of relating the businesses denying you service if you're not wearing a mask, and they said if a business can deny you service for, like, they were relating the pastry businesses that wouldn't bake cakes for LGBTQ couples, and they were relating that type of denial of service of a business to a business not allowing service to someone not wearing a mask. Do you think that those do you think businesses denying service for not wearing masks will be handled similarly to businesses who denied?
Yeah, I'm really, I get the example. I'm not seeing the connection that there were some bakers who declined to make specific types of cakes, and they raised both free speech and free exercise arguments. Problematic was that there are laws saying that you can't discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation, for example. I don't think there's any comparable law about mask wearing, right? The states can mandate masks. I think there might be some American with Disability Act requirements, because people can't wear masks just due to disabilities; they're not able to. But I don't think they'll have this sort of litigation. Look, I think the mask issue has become a bit of a partisan football, right? Wearing a mask is like, I think Trump tweeted this today. Of course he did. It's like people wear masks as a symbol to oppose me. Okay. But it has become political, and I think that's perhaps unfortunate. But I don't see any analogies to like Masterpiece Cake Shop. I don't think there's a linkage. Maybe.
I wasn't sure. I just saw a lot of people on social media making things that social media does. But
I quit. I stopped checking Twitter in January. I'm such a healthier person. It's lovely. Maybe one more question, then we all go home and finish dinner. Any other questions?
I think we might be able to finish dinner a little early.
All right, lovely. Well, thank you all. This was fun. If you have any questions, reach out. If you guys do any Zoom events with your American or Catholic chapters, definitely give me a call.
Thank you so much,
for joining
Professor
us,
Brockman.
Yeah, thank you so much, guys. Have a good night. Bye bye.
Enjoy your rest of your night. Bye,
Thank you.
guys.
Thank you so much for